Only mode.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm. We have today the webinar that is co-sponsored by the College of Continuing Studies at the University of Alabama. We have our presenter today is going to be Jim Satterfield, talking about violence prevention, identifying behaviors of concern. Jim is joining us today from San Diego, and Brenda, of course, is in Tuscaloosa. So we're scattered around the country a little bit here. We'd like to have you as our friend. Facebook, Firestorm Solutions. Please be a friend and like us and all those kind of good things. You can follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We'd like to remind you the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and this work product should be read in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. This information should not be considered legal advice or legal opinion. I mentioned that this webinar series is underwritten by the University of Alabama College of Continuing Studies. This is the 8th in the 2016 series. You can go to firestorm.com. You can watch past webinars in the series, and you can register for future webinars. And we have our very good friend, Brenda Truelove, with us today. Brenda is a program manager at the College of Continuing Studies. Brenda, over to you, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Jim, for the opportunity to share with the registered participants today on this topic that should be of concern to everyone. And we're really happy to be able to highlight, along with that, a training session that individuals might be interested in. It's our annual Human Resources Management Conference. It's in October 13th and 14th. This event is really a hallmark every year for a lot of HR professionals. We have designed this conference to develop a full range of skills and knowledge that is vital to those in the HR industry. You know, I really admire people in that specific area because you just have to be experts on so many things, and not a day goes by that something new is not thrust at them to take care of. So they're a great group of individuals, and we're really happy to work with them not only at our conference but year-round for other training events. So we're really happy and hope that a lot of employees in industrial relations, organizational development, of course the areas of benefits and compensation, but particularly of interest with this event will also be safety and security, legal compliance, all the different management practices that are so vital to any organization. So there's no better topic than what Jim's going to be sharing today about behaviors of concern. And so many of the topics that will be discussed in our HR conference will meld with that very nicely. So the gig economy is going to be one of the big topics that comes up, and we have some really awesome speakers. Michelle Adams, who's Vice President of Risk Management at Walt Disney, we're able to gain her speaker as a speaker for this conference. David Gray is President and CEO of Daxco, and Dr. Nick Horney is the founder of Agility Consulting and Training. He's just a fabulous individual and on the cutting edge of research and topic conversation for the VUCA industry. So again, our event is October 13th and 14th here on the campus of University of Alabama at the Bryant Conference Center. We have online registration, or if an individual would like to call and to find out more information, they can contact my dear friend Amanda Bergeron, who's a program manager for this event, 205-348-9966. Amanda has been the program manager for almost 20 years at our college and is widely versed in so many topics, and this is one of her areas of specialty. So we invite people to ask questions. And Jim, thanks so much again for our great partnership, and I'm really looking forward to, I've got a peek at your slide set today, and I can't wait to hear some of the information you're going to share.
Well, thanks, Brenda, and just jump in anytime as we do it and discuss it. And I have attended the conferences at the University of Alabama and spoken. I will tell you that it's a great opportunity to continue your exposure to thought leaders in a variety of fields. Today we're going to be talking about behaviors of concern. And so when you think about that, are you worried? What keeps you up at night? I think about the old Mad magazine with Alfred E. Newman on the cover, and it said, "What me worry?" But I think with a number of, we have several hundred people on today's webinar, and looking at that topic, apparently it resonated as we continue to see stories in the news and have experiences with events happening. Is it a problem? And you can see from some of the surveys that have been done, you can see that 92% of the people that we've surveyed have indicated, yeah, they're either very or somewhat concerned about the topic. But if you look at that survey on the other side, only half have received some training. There was a different one that we had done in another survey area, and it indicated how little was known and what would happen. So what that does is it puts us in a position that as these events occur, it comes as a surprise. And generally that means that our response will not be as well. Now, when we think about behaviors of concern, we want to know, could this actually be a way that we can prevent violence from occurring? And the answer is yes. If we can intervene before the gun comes to work, before the gun comes to school, it'll make a difference. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the events that we've seen. Were they terrorism? Were they workplace violence? Does it really matter to us at that? If we can identify the behavior of concern before we get to the violent act, there'll be a significantly different outcome. Now, there are warning signs, and we're going to talk a lot about warning signs today and give you some insights of where to focus and what to look for. But the common theme here is almost every time there was an identifying signal in advance, and that's what we want to put our attention on today. Now, if we're going to talk about that, can everybody pick the individual that's on the screen right now that looks like they're going to be on a path to violence? Well, it's pretty hard to pick them out of that crowd of folks in that black background there. But if you look, wait a minute, there's somebody right in the center as that little dot turns to the red. Well, if everybody would wave a flag that said, hey, I'm concerned, I'm upset, if I don't get this resolved, I'm going to commit a violent act, it'd be very easy. It's not a way. It is a way, though, where we look at factors that could lead us to the identification start to help. Without that, the individual blurs into the background of all the people that we have in our companies. And so today we're going to on identifying these behaviors of concern and to see how we can connect all the dots, and we'll come back about connecting the dots in a few minutes, to show you how these things can escalate and where you can make the steps that would make a difference. Because again, we want to find that person in the center, but more importantly, we want to find that person before it expands into a violent act and it dominates everyone within our organization. And then we're dealing with a life and safety situation. So when we think about, and we hear a lot about workplace violence, and we hear particularly about we need active shooter training, you need more than just waiting until the event occurs. You need to start identifying that potential in advance and intervening. Now, after every one of these events that occur, we see comments from people about, hey, I knew it was going to happen, there's always something going on with that guy. And you start to see there's been some indicators, but there's been no formal structure put together to take all those observations, all those comments, and do them in a centralized way so that we can make a difference. As you think about it, we would say, what if we could stop just one act of violence? What if we could prevent a death? What if we could prevent a suicide? Is it worth spending time in our organization to be able to deal with that? And the answer, I believe, that we'll all come to is say, yes, it would make a significant difference for each of us. So let's tell a story. We're going to have an employee. We're going to name the employee Fred. We're actually going to, his last name will be Rogers. So think about Mr. Rogers and Welcome to My Neighborhood as you were growing up. And Mr. Rogers receives a poor performance review, and he's happy. I don't think any of us are if we get that. He gets into an argument with security. It's noted in the security log. A coworker reports that Fred is upset and said, "You guys are going to be sorry." His absenteeism rate increases very abruptly. His friends hear him talking crazy, but they don't seem to want to intervene and get involved. Fred posts that he's tired of being treated like a dog, and he's going to make them sorry for that. So you've got several data points that are just out there and going. Well, one of the things that happens is we need to start to look at, are there other data points around Fred and what's going on? And focusing on who's in charge, can they see it? How do they see it? Where will they go? Are there just systems that would tie all of this information together? Or in fact, does it come as a surprise? Who knows this key information? And think about in your company, if these observations would have been seen, how would you become aware and how would others see? If we add to that other observations from other individuals, we still have a whole collection of dots, if you have here. But there must be a program in place to say, how do we connect the dots within our company to find those behaviors of concern before they can escalate to violence? And so a central repository, starting to pull those dots together, and we start connecting them and say, well, that's related to this. That could be seen in conjunction, and then there's more dots are starting to be connected, and then more and more. And finally, what emerges is a picture of a gun. We can see that this is an individual who's on a path to violence, and we want to make a difference. So it starts with thinking about Fred, thinking about what we see, what we hear, what he does, and what are the factors in his life that'll make a difference. So if you think about that, that's what we're going to be talking about today, and trying to centralize an approach to deal with these types of behaviors before the violence actually starts. So who commits it? And the answer is everybody. It's coworkers, managers, former employees. We do see people coming back to set the tone back with their company about what they need to do, how they need to be able to handle it. It could even be a customer or client who gets upset in the program. We've certainly seen stories in the news over the past few weeks about road rage and other activities that can occur. So how do we reduce this? Well, we've got to get a culture where we respect each other. We look at our political landscape today, and everybody speaks at each other. They don't speak with them. And so that starts to build up and just increase the pressure between individuals. But you need policies and procedures dealing with workplace violence, weapons in the workplace, hostile workplace environment, bullying. And so we've got to train everyone to let's look for what the warning signs are, to see how we would identify those, and there has to be a way to report them. If we understand that, and then we can have a team that will deal with threat management within our organization, and they can conduct a behavioral risk and threat assessment. We always are still going to need physical security. We're not trying to be touchy-feely here and not think about we have to have layers of security. And as you all know, physical security is around access. It's keeping the bad guys out associated with it. It's fences, it's doors, it's locks, it's cameras, it's lights, it's all of those areas. And another element is the monitoring of what's going on, what's being said. And many times we can pick this up via social media. And then specific response protocols if the threat materializes. What are you going to do if, in fact, we get to that point that it's an active shooter, to be able to deal with those elements? So what are the lessons that we've learned when we think about workplace violence that will give us a pathway to begin to understand this area? Well, first, there's always warning signs. Let me say that one more time. There are always warning signs. We're going to be looking at trying to talk about what those are and separate them out. And when people plan to do a violent act, or when people have ill intent, the 80% of the time someone else knows, and 67% of the time 2 or more people know. And so what we're trying to do is to take advantage of the fact that others know that someone will come forward, someone will share those insights with us, or we will see those being discussed on social media and can respond, and we'll talk about intelligence networks before we finish today to keep that processing going. But when this violence attack thought starts, you'll see that pattern develop there. But we've also found that many people are reluctant to come forward. So if it's not a part of your culture, then you're going to find out those comments that we saw in the little balloons at the beginning, where people say, oh yeah, I saw that, but I didn't do anything. So we've got to find a way to increase anonymous reporting to make this process work. Now, people don't just snap. It's not a matter of boom, it occurs. There's been this pathway that's going through. It's a step after a step after a step and leading to the element that we're talking about. But if they're out there, these little visions may not get reported, and that's going to be a problem. Now, there's a difference between threats and behaviors of concern. And what's the difference? Jim, can you spot the red apple? Yep, I think I can see that red apple. A threat is an immediate notification. We're going to assume that any threat is real, that it's actionable, that it's going to be carried out, that it's going to be something that we must deal with at that point in time. So it becomes very critical for us to be able to recognize that, and that starts a whole response chain. The behaviors of concern, those are the green apples that you see there. Takes a little bit more insight in determining that element associated with it. So when we think about it, what is threatening behavior? What does it look like? It's bullying, it's cyberbullying, it's fights, it's stalking. In a school environment, it could be date violence, threats, verbal and physical. Someone that brings a weapon to work. All of those elements would be very clear to understand. Now, we would still evaluate the likelihood of the threat, the capability to carry it out, but a threat just immediately sets off that red dot that we saw in an earlier slide. It takes you immediately to that point. So let's look at things that are a little bit more subtle and figure out what we need to do. Those become then the behaviors of concern. Some of those red flags are very, very clear. Anyone that discusses suicide, that's a behavior of concern that you must assume is real. Now, most of you have not had training to learn how to identify a real bomb from a fake bomb. Well, same thing with suicide. If there's an implication that that's evoked, that's one that needs to be referred, and immediate actions need to intercede there for the individual. One other element that sometimes is missed is that many of the times when we find someone threatening suicide, they have a kill list. Here's the list that I'm going to even the score with regarding this particular event. It's going to be, I'm going to get even, and then, I'll deal with the suicide element. So that's a very clear indicator. Weapons, intimidating comments, destroying property, fits of rage. Somebody that's been normally easygoing just takes that out of proportion and reacts in a meeting or a conversation. When we were starting Firestorm, I was working with a manufacturing company in their safety committee, and in the safety committee meeting, 2 members of the safety committee got into a fight, which is a little humorous when you think about safety and the fact that it comes to blows associated. Those that blame others, somebody that's always complaining, somebody that's always filing a grievance, the loner, those are warning signs and behaviors of concern that start to become clear, but not everything is always clear. Fascination with weapons, depression, substance abuse. Sometimes that's hard to see in the workplace, but maybe indicators with poor quality of performance, some absenteeism, late arrivals could well be tied into it. But the main thing we're looking at is look at the one right in the middle where it says major changes in behavior. When we think about behaviors of concern, that's where we want to put our focus, is what's the change. The person that's always been outgoing now suddenly becomes introverted, or the reverse, someone that's quiet now becomes vocal, becomes paranoid at those points in time. So change is one of the key indicators when we think about behaviors of concern. Right at this point of becoming a red flag, we're going to need to happen. So who might pose a threat? What's the highest risk factor here? Well, when we think about them, it's the accumulation of all the factors that we've been talking about up to this point. The multiple losses, one that's had a divorce or a death in a family, bankruptcy, or other pressures that are starting to happen. You'll see those things start to lead up. Maybe they've gotten a bad performance review. Maybe they feel their job is in jeopardy. Maybe there's about layoffs that could be coming in the corporation. You just are accumulating points, if you will, that will push that individual where they feel they don't have any other option but to ask out. So as you see these, start to look at it, and those are the ways that the behaviors start to accumulate to add up, to be pushing to that point of a violent action. Now, there are protective factors, and we'll talk about these a couple of times before we finish today, but personal attachments, the person that has friends at work, in their community, in their church, outside interests that are there that they're involved with. There is a respect for authority. They're going to yield and move in that. And what are their coping skills? Their ability to deal with trauma, to deal with differences that are coming in, and someone who will take responsibility for their own actions. So what leads to violence? We can take everything we've talked about and put it into three buckets. One is the support systems. These are mitigating factors. One are what's going on physically in the workplace. Those could be indicators of this thing starting to escalate. And then personal factors. Think about what's going on with that individual. Excessive use of alcohol or drugs, aggressive history, lack of positive self-esteem, psychological aggression. You can tell that there's the way that this individual responds to others, that there's a path that's being led at that point in time. So you're putting this information together and processing it. And all of that's going to come together, and you're going to create a real snapshot. Now, I'll warn you, the next slide has got a lot of information on it. And I'm not trying to get you to focus on any one element, but the idea that you need to look at the individual as a whole. So when we think about a behavioral snapshot, we can start with their psychological and biological factors that could be there. There's social and peer factors. There's threat-related behavior. There's actions in the workplace. And there are things that are going on with the family. All of those pieces of the puzzle surround the person that you're concerned about from a behavior of concern. Now, there are protective factors around the outside of this, and we talked about those, and you'll see them over in the bottom left-hand corner. When you view it this way, it puts it in perspective that it is a snapshot. Where is this person at this time? And we're looking, is this increasing? Is it staying the same? Is it decreasing? And these would give you the indications that you need to go forward with to analyze. Now, we'll talk about a program that will pull all of these elements together in just a few minutes. But when I talk change, let's go back and spend just a minute there. Why do you need to do behavior screening? Why do we need to make an evaluation of, is this person on a pathway to violence? Well, it's because we need to look at it over time. And screening then helps us to see where they were last week, where they are this week, and those changes. Now, that circle that's in the middle, imagine it's a red rubber ball, and it's been thrown down, and you can't tell whether it's bouncing straight up or is it already hit its height and it's on its way down. That's why you have to do the screening and do the analysis over time to come in to be able to opine on, is this individual an immediate risk and where we're trying to identify. Now, when we think about behavioral risk and assessment, it's got four key components: awareness, intelligence, central repository, and then this behavioral risk threat assessment plan. And we'll go through those at a high level in just a few minutes. So Awareness training. Everybody in your organization needs to know what to look for. What are those warning signs? What do we do about those? And wait a minute, if something comes in, how do I follow the say something, see something, say something? By the way, that's generally been a failure in most organizations because the culture isn't created an easy environment to do that. The intelligence network was built immediately on it with the anonymous reporting. Now, we'll talk about anonymous reporting in just a second. But if you have an anonymous reporting system, is it you can go to HR, you can tell your supervisor, there's a suggestion box, you may even have an anonymous phone line. But when we talk about XGen today, we need to make sure that we have a anonymous text reporting capability. That becomes extremely critical because our young people are more used to doing things on their phone with a text message than making a phone call. So anonymous reporting now is a key element to put this in place. The monitoring of social media is going to become extremely important. I'll talk about that in just a second. And it goes back to those statistics. If someone has ill intent, 80% of the time somebody else knows, and 67% of the time 2 or more people know. Standard reporting methods, obviously your pre-screening and background checks, and one recommendation there is if you're doing background checks on your employees, which we would want to look at misdemeanors on the county level. If you're only doing a search of the federal felony database, if an individual had been arrested by the police on a felony but then plea bargained down to a misdemeanor, you would miss it. Also, in looking at that, you would find out information about DUIs and other elements. And then key metrics. What's been happening with this individual? Is their performance being maintained? Is it their absenteeism is going up, their lateness, their quality of work? Those are elements that are there. Now, the intelligence network is important because you can identify those individuals very easily there. And we're in an environment today where this is much easier than it would have been in the past. Last September, we got a phone call from one of the Firestorm clients, and they're a large restaurant organization, and they had on a Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock posted on their corporate Facebook page a death threat. The individual with a made-up name had said, I'm going to go to this particular restaurant on Friday, and I'm going to kill everybody there. So they called us and asked, could we do something? And Karen Mazzullo, who's our EVP and Chief Intelligence Officer, started to do the research. She was able to uncover the first name of the individual, then the girlfriend's name, then his last name, then his home address. And it turns out it was a 17-year-old who'd worked in the restaurant, who'd been fired, who was threatening to go back and settle the score. And notifying the client, and all of that was done in less than 2 hours. They were able to coordinate with the police, and then the police went and talked at the home and addressed the matter. While that was being done, a geofence was set up around the restaurant to monitor communications in and out via social media, and it was found that the manager at that particular restaurant was selling drugs out the back. So when you look at this, this is something that you can find out and know, and knowing about those behaviors in advance will make a difference for the threats of violence. Similarly, we put up a geofence around a distribution center for a large national company, and looking at that, we found an employee who made 80 postings in one 8-hour shift, and they started to escalate with problems at work and what was going on, and difficulty with his supervisor, and then indications that it was racial. And the final posting of the day said, there's only one way to solve that, and that's with a gun. I'm bringing a gun to work tomorrow to settle this once and for all. So when you look at that, wouldn't you rather know today, or would you rather want to wait until tomorrow when that individual is coming in? So this is an area that when you think about. Yes, Karen?
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just someone asked a question, and I wanted to make one little housekeeping comment. Your voice, I'm not sure if you're on a headset, but you fade in and out, and we lose you. So we don't want to lose you because we love your voice. So I wanted to let you know.
All right. I will address, and hopefully this will be better. Does that sound better?
It sounds really good, Jim. Thank you. The other thing is, people have asked in the questions about the, legalities of what you were just talking about. And on a really high level, I would just like to say that we're not looking at anything private, anything that's out there publicly. All we're doing is aggregating it and using intelligence to put it in context and understand it better. But that's something you might want to just mention, Jim, because people have asked about it. Thank you.
Well, in fact, you just mentioned it, and that's great. And Karen, thanks for jumping in. The information, imagine I took a can of spray paint and I wrote something on the outside of the building. Well, anyone driving down the road would be able to see those comments written on the outside of the building. And that's the same thing. Now, we're not hacking into password-protected social media accounts, but as comments are shared, many of those are shared in a public way that anyone can see. You're entitled to know that information. One legal aspect that would be supportive of what you're talking about here is the ability to continue that information knowledge, but be controlled about where it's shared within your organization. You may learn something on social media that you didn't intend to know, the sexual choice of a particular individual. Well, if later that person was terminated and that information had been shared, they could allege that, wait a minute, the only reason you fired me was because of my sexual orientation. So there needs to be a program, just like with anything else. There's a right way and a wrong way to do it. What's the best that we can put in place? There also has to be the anonymous reporting, as we've talked about. Firestorm works with Tip Now. It provides the ability to have voicemail, email, text messages, all anonymously to get that information in, and it comes in, and we'll talk about a central repository in a moment. But the tipster sees the information, sends it, and then it could later be utilized for you within your organization. The central repository that I mentioned is pulling all of that information together in a central point so that your threat management team can then evaluate the information and make a determination, is this person on a path to violence? And that's the overwhelming comment that we want to keep in focus at every step along the way. So by putting it in a central repository, you've got the anonymous tip, you've got the observations from coworkers, from management, you've got the results of the individual, and then you can opine and make a determination. And that leads us into the idea of a behavioral risk threat assessment program. That's the acronym that you see at the top. This central repository gives us the ability to have all of that together, and if you saw something, you could fill out a report and put it in, as well as the tips coming directly into it. Those are then reviewed by your threat management team, and they're able to then address those issues. So under this BERTHA plan, you categorize the risk initially. Is this low, medium, or high? Now, there's criteria, and that training would take place, but the key here is, if it's low, it's a normal discipline issue. We need to sit down and talk with this employee. We need to talk with Fred that we talked about earlier to be able to deal with those elements. If it's high, Fred's standing there with a gun, we're calling 911. If those two divisions become very easy, it's the middle category where our focus has to be addressed. In that area, is it guarded just a little bit worse than a normal discipline issue? Is it up to an elevated status that we really need to have an intervention in a program? Is it severe where we need to move this individual out, and before they come back have an evaluation incoming? So this is an opportunity then for the threat management team to make those screening decisions. You may ultimately have to refer it out to a third party for evaluation, but that screening can be done. Generally, a threat management team within an organization includes HR, someone from security or facilities, and then finally someone from operations. We always want a minimum of 3 people on our threat management team, so it never boils down to a single individual making a decision. Now, the program is organized as you see on the screen, and there are a lot of moving parts. There's the awareness that we talked about at the very beginning. of our conversation today that you've got to make sure that everybody's aware of what they're looking for. The intelligence network, how the reports come in, the monitoring of social media, those elements are there, the background checks, pre-screening, the key metrics that we talked about, absenteeism, performance, et cetera. Then the program under BERTHA, you've got the initial tip or the report coming in. You do that initial screening, low, medium, and high. Then the threat management team starts to look at those that are medium to talk about what kind of an investigation do we need to do, what type of screening needs to take place. Then we monitor and then have a case management plan, because it takes us a lot to get an employee into our company. How do we manage that employee so that we can salvage that relationship? We're working with a manufacturer where they found an employee that came and had worked in the wars of recent time, had post-traumatic stress, and walking on the shop floor, he looks up and goes, you know, if I put a gunman here and one over there, I can control the field of vision and we can control the floor. And so they didn't immediately react, but they got counseling. They got this individual involved to identify that world is different here than it was in Iraq. And so from that standpoint, we had a positive outcome, and the employee was able to adapt and kept involvement with the company, and it became an invaluable contributor. And then there has to be a sign-off and record keeping in the central repository. Outside of it, the HR procedures, the response protocols, the security assessments of physically what do we have in place, all of those come together to create the workplace violence prevention program. Now, I mentioned these elements, the guarded, elevated, and severe, and you see some descriptions here. The guarded, it's just a little bit more than our normal area. We're going to work with that individual. Elevated, we're not sure. This could go one of two ways. It could continue on and escalate, or we can de-escalate it. And so here we'd have to have a specific plan, a case management plan of working with that individual. A severe risk level, we're just one step away from this violent act. Then we're going to suspend that employee. We're going to want to have an outside expert, a forensic psychologist or psychiatrist, evaluate this person for reentry. And if they come back into work, what's our reentry plan? How will we manage that? How will we maintain it? Generally, it's better to move through a suspension than going to an immediate termination at this point, because no violent act has physically taken place. There is one last level that can happen in this behavioral screening level by the threat management team, and it could be the conclusion that, wait a minute, this is imminent and we need to call the authorities immediately at that point in time. So we've covered a lot of ground, and recommendations for you at this point are that you've got to take action. You have to do all of the things we've talked about, the awareness, looking at the behaviors of concern, having reporting, the ability to do the threat assessments, in getting everyone involved. Training is going to be critical, particularly for the threat management team, to make those decisions, because the difference between guarded, elevated, and severe become very clear at that point. You need an intelligence network. You are monitoring at an all-hazards approach. What's the weather like around our location? So if you know that storms were imminent, that you'd be taking actions and intervening. In that case, we can think about storms that would occur in behavior. How are we monitoring it and how are we tracking it? By the way, there are new insurance products out around active shooter and around this particular area of deadly weapons. You might want to meet as you look with your risk manager within your organization, just as you have insurance for business interruption or damage to property or liability. There are special coverages here that not only provide financial support, but there are other tools that come with it. And then finally, who are your support resources outside of the company? Do you have a forensic psychologist that you can go to that can provide that additional assistance? So what are your next steps? Think about an awareness and prevention training program within your organization. That's a very beginning point. You need to then establish this intelligence network that we've talked about. You've got to have the plan for workplace violence prevention program, and look at what your emergency response protocols are if in fact they occur. A lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, and evacuate. How will you be dealing with it? We get an awful lot of requests for active shooter training, and we certainly can do that, but the focus should be before that point back into it. If you find yourself in a crisis, pick up the phone and call us. We have a program called Crisis Stop. We'll get on the phone with you immediately in that first hour because the actions, decisions, and words become very critical, and it'll set the tone of what's the outcome going to be of this event. You can call Firestorm. We will help you. There will be no charge for that first hour. Look at your analysis of your insurance coverages and make sure they align to your response plans. You don't want to surprise and find out that there's really not coverage in an area that could help. You want to stress test your plan. See if it works. Does it come together as you would like? I'll also remind you that on Thursday of this week, we're going to do a founders call with the founders of Firestorm, and we've invited an insurance professional to join us in the conversation, and we're going to be talking specifically about active shooter. And so if that's a topic that you're interested in, I know you're on the call today, that's going to be Thursday at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, and I think you'll find it an enlightening hour as we talk about where we are and where we see these things going. There's also a white paper briefed on today's webinar, and you can have copies of some of the slides embedded in it, and you can go to firestorm.com/briefs and be able to download that information and see where we are. So I wanted to thank the University of Alabama again for underwriting this webinar series. Brenda, any observations you want to share with us at this time?
Well, thank you, Jim, and I really enjoyed your presentation today, and I always learn something. As right before the webinar started, I've got my new 2016 University of Alabama Academic Planner, and I immediately flipped to the front part to make sure that the reporting, alarming, and threatening behavior portion was still listed, and I was breathed a sigh of relief to see that it is in place in there. And you know, that's just unfortunately on college campuses, that's something that's got to be foremost in everyone's purview, is make sure you know what to do and who to call. And so this webinar today was a good reminder for organizations and had some valuable information to make sure individuals know what their plan is ahead of time. But you're always a great resource in times of crisis, so thanks to you and your team for always a good session. And again, the information is on the screen about our upcoming HRM conference.
And I would encourage you to all consider that as a good next step in these types of areas. So thank you for joining us today. If you've got questions, you can go to firestorm.com to download the brief or to reach out to us, or you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com. We've had a lot of people on the call today, and we couldn't get to, obviously, the questions, but we'll try to reach out to each one of you to answer and see how we can be of help. If you find yourself in a crisis or need emergency assistance or just want to talk about this subject, you can call us at 800-321-2219. Thank you today for your input and your involvement. We appreciate it, and I look forward to speaking with you again next month or on Thursday of this week at the Founders Forum call. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. And Brenda, I guess I should say roll tide. Football season will be here too. There you go. Have a great day, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.